Hey, how's it going, folks? Thanks for stopping by another ADHD video by good old Will. So for today, we're going to talk about a pretty spicy, as they call it, thing. We're going to talk about living in a home, in a house, where multiple family members, or if not every family member's got ADHD, and the madness and the shenanigans and the threats and the saying of things that we probably don't mean or will need to apologize about later and stuff of that nature. So that's what we're going to be talking about for today. I also apologize for the noise in the background. There is a windstorm going on in this part of town, you see. So I apologize. I have a very busy schedule, and this is some of the only time I have off, so I figure why not make another hopefully helpful content for y'all. So anyway, for today, this discussion is going to be some serious content matter, but I'm going to try to deliver it in a manner that's not going to be just brutal reflection on some of the hard stuff. Because some of this stuff is a bit funny, especially when we look back and we see how we can overreact. And at the same time, we got to sometimes know not to have our guard up a little too much, or perhaps too much of a weight on our shoulders that we might have for ourselves unconsciously. So just some things to reflect upon before we get into the whole nitty gritty for today. So with that being said, let's talk about it. Let's get into a couple of things, learn a couple of definitions, and let's see what we can do with this. So, number one on the list. We got to know what rejection-sensitive dysphoria is. Once again, for those people who don't know, rejection-sensitive dysphoria, RSD for short, is something that people with ADHD, majority of people, or a good amount of people, from what I've heard and what I've seen, have this. What it is, RSD, is that when someone with ADHD experiences disappointment, experiences like they've been rejected heavily by someone they cared about or a situation they cared about, or if they let somebody down, it just makes them feel absolutely horrible. And it can feel like some hardcore depression. And unfortunately, some people feel suicidal for a few hours maybe. Sometimes it lingers longer or less depending on who you are. The point is to be careful of yourself and what you can do and what you can say when the RSD is hit, when you feel like a family member has disappointed you, or like you've disappointed them by perhaps saying something you shouldn't have said, or something was said to you that perhaps really hurt. This can set off RSD pretty bad. And what ends up happening for a lot of family members, that when they set off RSD, or when their RSD is set off, they're not really aware that they're like hurt. They might just feel intense. And that might be a normal thing because of how frequently it might happen. That the reflex is just to, okay, well, my RSD was set off, so let me say the worst thing I can think imaginable to hurt the person who just set off my RSD. That's something I've seen a lot in family members, or in families I've worked with that have family members that have ADHD and RSD. So, rejection-sensitive dysphoria. If you would like to see some further information on it, and the video talks about how RSD affects us in daily situations in life, and how it stops us from doing certain things, and the pretty big impact it has in our mental processing of things. You'd be surprised. I recommend to check that video out. Also, for those of you who do know what RSD is, and perhaps want to get a couple of tactics and helpful remedies on how to tame RSD and keep it on check and what to do when you're experiencing it, I made a video on that too, if you want to check it out. There should be a link up above, and I put some time and effort into it. There's some really helpful techniques, some really helpful information that would have helped old Wilhelm out back in the day, so I really hope that you guys can get some benefit out of it, or perhaps share it with someone you think would benefit from it. So, going back a little bit to RSD before we move on to the next two terms. Our central nervous system is heightened. Those of us with ADHD, as you can see the picture above, the central nervous system plays a very important role in physiology and in biology, and how we act, how we don't act, etc., etc. So, when you have a central nervous system that's really easily excitable, that gets startled easily due to our ancestors, it's believed by some that ADHD is a condition that exists because our nomadic ancestors needed to be on high alert and needed to have that nomadic lifestyle. And you can go deeper and deeper into it. I have a video of myself many years ago on this channel if you want to check it out. I'm thinking of updating it, making a more recent one. But if you want to check out more on that theory, there's a guy by the name of Hartman that I really recommend. There should be a picture above where you can see. And there you go, because it's a really interesting discussion. You see what your pros and cons are from that perspective and applying the knowledge of ADHD, and there is more current research on that as well if you just look out there. The website NCBI is a really helpful place to go look, so I recommend it. Anyway, so RSD, really big impact on us. Our central nervous system, when something really makes us feel horrible, or somebody threatens us, or we feel threatened, or like somebody else we care about maybe is threatened, yeah, we're gonna get on high alert and we might get into brutal mode, the fight or flight or escape. We might get into that. And depending on how we grew up and our trauma, that's gonna dictate what we're gonna do. Unfortunately, sometimes when we're in that heightened state of fight, flight, or escape, we're in this intense physiological mode where we're in survival mode. So sometimes verbally we try to put a stop to that. And sometimes we have these bad habits that we do because we just want to stop the person from making us feel bad, or we want to reciprocate bad habit of just returning the bad feeling. Sometimes we just can't handle it. We've been pushed past our limit perhaps, and that's completely understandable. But at the same time, we got to be aware of what's going down perhaps, so we can call it out on ourselves, or maybe talk to one of our family members who's doing it to us, because they might not be aware. Some of these things in certain cultures, unfortunately, are very common. It might not even be known. It might just be considered the way. I don't know if you understand what I mean by that. What I mean by that is that behavior might be so normalized that it's not questioned. For myself as an intuitive, I grew up around certain people that had a tendency to not look at certain things intuitively. And because of this, as an intuitive myself, I would really clash, because I would want to talk about possibilities and the deeper meaning of certain things, and sometimes people would be very rude to me and tell me, don't question things like that, you just have to respect it for what it is. And I'm like, I'm not disrespecting, I just want to talk about a deeper aspect of it. So anyway, I believe there should always be room for discussion. So anyways, but as that side note could be pretty triggering for some people. It can trigger someone's RSD in the home, especially if you question a parent or family member's way of doing something, or maybe you point something out to them that kind of makes them feel ashamed or embarrassed. All those sorts of things. You tie in all that into living in a home, especially where multiple family members have ADHD and RSD. Yeah, it's gonna be like straight up WWF 98 Royal Rumble, Well, exaggerating a little bit, but you know what I mean. It's gonna be, it might be multiple people yelling, it might be doors slamming, sassiness and attitude, and just all sorts of, the type of stuff you would probably see on early 90s, daytime television and stuff like that. Sorry, I don't mean to exaggerate, but it can get pretty brutal. We gotta be serious about it. It can get pretty brutal. But we can stop ourselves with a little knowledge and asking for help and asking for consideration. So let's learn these two definitions now that we've talked about some of the details. Here they are. Tactic number 1. we have emotional baiting. Emotional baiting is a manipulative tactic that is consciously or unconsciously used by people in order to provoke / incite an emotional and or rage-filled response / behavior from another person or group of people. So basically, you're just being trolled emotionally, or especially by those family member or friends who know your weaknesses. They're just going to use that to ignite you, to just perhaps just trigger you, whatever word you want to use. They're just trolling you to get that reaction out of you. And unfortunately, in some families, that's used against the person afterwards, even though the family member was the reason why they got to that altered state to begin with, unfortunately, sometimes. So we have to be careful when this happens. What can we do? Well, one thing we can do is call it out, but not in a brutal sort of way. Just be like, you know what? I don't feel good when you talk to me like that. It's really hard for me to hear what you're saying when you're speaking to me, trying to make me feel harsh or intense. Sometimes we gotta open up our heart and how we feel, and sometimes it's very scary to do that, especially if we live the life of ADHD where a lot of people perhaps were not as considerate to us as we deserved. But there is a way to stand up for yourself. You don't have to be brutal about it. If you know the truth is on your side, use that as your motivation. It's not always easy to stand up for yourself and to say out loud what hurts you, but in this case, it's helpful to do so. You don't have to reveal everything about yourself. Just say, hey, this hurts me. I've read about this in a psychology post or whatever that says that this is emotional baiting, where you're trying to get me to act a certain way. Unfortunately, that happens sometimes in families because it's stimulating, unfortunately, for the brain to be in fighting mode. For some people, that brings up the reward system a little bit. They're getting that norepinephrine kick that we so lack, which affects dopamine inversely as well. So, because if you have, or if you lack dopamine, you're also going to lack norepinephrine. So, some people just crave that stimulation from conflict and fighting. That's why sometimes they watch shows or movies that just have constant, intensity or dramatic things happening. Sometimes the mind just wants to be stimulated by something, because ADHD is the mind being understimulated, especially for those of us who don't have the ADHD taken care of, meaning that they're not seeking treatment to help it out. Or something else that you can do is when your family member is in a better mood and in the right time, perhaps when it's just you two one-on-one, you can talk to your family member about what I'm talking about right now. Let's be okay with talking about it. And let's try our best not to do this to each other, but to be able to communicate better. You might get a little resistance when you first bring that up, or indifference. And that's because your other family member might be a little hurt, and it's hard for them to come to that emotional state, that of which is understanding. Like perhaps you right now have understood and are going to reflect on it, I hope. The other definition, gaslighting. Gaslighting is a form of manipulation where lies, denial, and distortions of the truth are used against the victim in order to cause the victim to question their memory, judgments, sanity, and sense of reality. Gaslighting is a really manipulative thing to do, especially to those of us who have ADHD, because a lot of people with ADHD have a pretty bad short-term memory. Perhaps really good long-term memory, but really bad short-term memory, where if someone tells you something within the immediate, and then a couple of seconds later, or maybe a minute or so later, you got to repeat it again, you kind of forgot what was told to you. So in a conversation, unfortunately, that can happen. And some people could be manipulated with that because a family member or your partner might call you out and they might feel bad because of something. Maybe they got caught in something, or because they can't handle like the fact that you're telling them the truth to their face about something bad that they perhaps did. So what can happen is some people can use this tactic, gaslighting, to distract you from the truth and for them to keep doing the bad habit that they're doing. Believe it or not, this might be an unconscious thing. Some people are not aware of this. As I've mentioned before, some people think that's the way, because unfortunately, some people see that from their families growing up, or friends, or those who are around them, in the neighborhood, wherever it is. When you're young, especially in your childhood years, those are such critical years. They're going to give you a big blueprint as to who you're going to be later in your life. Knowledge is power, but we got to apply that knowledge into our decision making, into our behavior, to be able to really make a difference. So I ask you to reflect. If you're someone who was unconscious about gaslighting people, perhaps you didn't know. Or perhaps the other way around, perhaps it was done to you and you feel really harsh about it, like, why would they do that to me? We gotta understand that when you have ADHD, emotions are heightened so much that sometimes the guilt someone might feel about doing something, they're gonna do everything in their power to say anything they can so they don't have to face that guilt, because it's that brutal to them because of how they've lived. Having a life of ADHD is not an easy thing. It's really tough, especially as you go back over the years. Less knowledge was known back in the day. You go back through the decades and the knowledge on mental health, as the years go by, we gain knowledge. But for a lot of us in the eras in the eras that we grew up, perhaps not a lot of knowledge of ADHD was known. And we have a lot of wounds and a lot of hurts and perhaps some resentment even. But we got to understand that for those of us who are a bit older, perhaps, we grew up in eras where there wasn't much knowledge of ADHD. And for those of us, perhaps, we feel guilty. Well, you got to understand, you guys, the mainstream media is not showing this type of stuff in entertainment. I'm starting to see it more on social media, which hopefully I'll start seeing it in certain programming, maybe even in some cartoons in the future. I think that'd be pretty cool to really emphasize help in mental health, but to make the content also entertaining too. Add some culture and art to it. But at the same time, put some mental health aspects into it. I love good writing, and I'd love to see something like that happen someday. Anyways though, moving on to what I was saying. It's really hard sometimes. We feel really guilty, like we can't own up to our mistakes, because perhaps other people might call us out on it, and for us, we might think that, I don't think I can handle that. It's going to be used against me. I want to tell you that you can handle it. You have to believe in yourself, and you have to know that you're going up against something that's bigger than you or I. It's cultural conditioning from wherever culture you're from. As human beings, we have so many things in common, but how we're conditioned by our surroundings gives us distinct behaviors, views, and habits, and etc., etc. The more educated you are, the more understanding we can become if we allow ourselves to be. So certain things in certain walks of life can make ADHD, or having ADHD, pretty intense and pretty brutal. We have to be understanding of the different eras that we've all grown up, including the youngsters right now. We have to be considerate to ourselves and to our family members and not hold resentment. For some families, there's a shame to having ADHD. They feel like if there's any mental health issue that their son or daughter or any of their kids have, or maybe that they might have, but they don't want anyone to know about it because it's going to bring shame to the family. I have a video that talks about coming to terms with ADHD. I have a whole playlist of inspirational talks and some deep reflections on some of the wounds, perhaps, or some of the misconceptions, or some of the inspirations that we might need, all regarding ADHD. There should be a link to a playlist above. Mental health should not be a negatively stigmatized thing. We're humans, and at this point we should be understanding of mental health. I do believe that with knowledge we can be more considerate to each other. So with these two terms, emotional baiting and gaslighting, reflect upon yourself. If you've done it, it's okay. Forgive yourself. You might have not known. And if you did know, still forgive yourself. You can make the change. And so can your family members and those who you allow to know about this subject matter. Be brave. I know it's not easy, but I believe in you. And a whole community of ADHD people does too. You give it your all. You got this. We unconsciously, or sometimes consciously, disrespect our value systems. We as humans have different value systems. What I mean by value systems is we have different things that we give importance to that mean a lot to us in various different areas of life. So how we speak about certain things, how we deliver information, how we like to be told information, there's a distinct way that we kind of have a tendency to do it. Also how we rationalize information, how we intake it. Do we think more intellectually? Do we think more with emotion? Do we think more with passion? Do we think more in a critical manner? Does the subject matter? Absolutely. There's so many variables to this. But if you study within cognitive functions, within the MBTI, the 16 personality types, and just to reiterate, out of those 16 personality types, there exist 16 other billions and billions of iterations. There is no one type of person that's exactly like another. At least in my opinion, and from what I've seen. But there are similarities, and some heavy similarities that I've seen in my research of people of cognitive function. So what I've noticed is that we have people of the thinking function and we have people of the feeling function, like the picture shows above. These are some general points. Obviously, these can overlap from different human beings in different eras and different points in their life. We can refine, we can weaken all of these functions. The goal is to balance out each of these functions and to be able to see the other person's perspective. Doing that will be quite helpful in how you communicate to other people. For me, as a thinking type, majority of my life I was saying certain things in a manner of which I thought I just wanted to be truthful and logical with what I was saying. What I didn't realize growing up is that the delivery of how I was saying these things was what was causing people not to want to listen or to just say something negative to me. That's the biggest piece of advice I can give a thinking type, is how you deliver the facts or the information is going to make it or break it, as in if the person or if a feeling type is going to take what you're saying or not and give it validity or even give it a chance. And this also applies to thinking types too, but the delivery of how we're told something, what words you use, the intonation, how fast you say it, whether you look at the person's eyes or not, all these details come into play. Or where you even deliver the information from, you know what I mean? You're gonna break up with somebody over text message? It's a little naughty if you ask old Wilhelm, a little inconsiderate, but some of us are really afraid to face rejection up front or have issues with conflict. This all has to do with our value systems. So, as we look at some of these very just straightforward points, much more goes into this. And for any of you who would like to see perhaps a video series on how ADHD impacts each of the 16 personality types in a different variety of ways, there should be a link up above to a playlist of that, the 16 personality types and how ADHD impacts them and what we can do. And there's also videos in there about how ADHD impacts the relationships of the 16 personality types and what could be done and what to look out for and all that other good jazz. So anyway, so here in the thinking side we see logic, objective, frankness, truth, justice, critique, task oriented. Then on the feeling side we have values, personal, tactfulness, love, mercy, praise, people oriented. So very different value systems. As a thinking type myself, I really do value fairness. I value fact and truth. And how I feel about that truth sometimes is not really relevant. And that's something I see that's a difficulty with certain feeling types, that it's hard to separate how you feel from what you might be talking about. Now that's not every feeling type, that's just some. There's some feeling types I worked with who really have their feeling function on check. And they can talk about stuff and put their perhaps bias or point of view aside to talk about what we're talking about. For a thinking type, that's a lot of the time not very difficult to do. It depends on what type of thinking type, obviously, and the details that makes that person who they are. But sometimes thinking types, we say things that are a little too brutal, if you catch my drift. And the feeling type is like, why would you say such a thing? How come you can't tell me like this, or like that, or like this, or like that? That sort of stuff. So sometimes in the family or in a home, there's quite a bit of a mixture of both. So sometimes in the home, there's quite a bit of a mixture of both. Might have certain thinking types and feeling types. And depending on the family member role, sometimes the mom might be the thinking type, sometimes the father might be the feeling type. You can mix that up in any way or capacity you want with the different iterations of relationships that exist. And then sometimes, ironically enough, the kids might be completely different from the parents in their functions. So this can complicate things a lot, because even the kids can trigger the parents by saying something that perhaps is considered extremely dishonorable, and the parent gets really brutal and the RSD gets set off and all that other stuff. So we gotta be careful because of that. We gotta be aware of our triggering points, of what ignites us in a positive way and also in a negative way. Like what really kind of, grinds our gears, so to speak. The more we know about it, the better we're gonna be able to tame it. So really important. So one other important thing to mention about the thinking and feeling types is that a lot of the time there's more of an immediacy from certain feeling types of wanting something to resolve itself right away, perhaps. Because a lot of feeling types, they have a really big heart. They really do mean well. But they want things to get resolved perhaps a little too quickly. And life doesn't always work like that. Sometimes we need to give stuff time to grow and blossom so we can reflect upon it. And a lot of the time, in some families, there's certain things that are a little too difficult to talk about. And no one wants to approach the big elephant in the room because it might cause too much friction. In order to be able to talk about these things, folks, we're gonna have to feel a little uncomfortable. And that's perfectly fine, that's okay. We have to get comfortable feeling sometimes a bit uncomfortable when we need to bring up something that perhaps is not the most comfortable thing to talk about, but in the long run will be really helpful to you, your family, and friends. So have faith in yourself, believe in yourself, practice how you're gonna say it. Later on in this video, I'm gonna have a nice little picture that's gonna give you some ways of how to use certain words and how to not use other words and how it'll make it all gravy, baby, and all that good stuff. So stick around, okay? I believe in you. Anyway, so for thinking and feeling types, just be considerate of one another. And feeling types, understand that thinking types are sometimes they just go to the truth or just to the core fact of something a little too quick. That's sometimes the skill of a thinking type, not of all thinking types. But if you ever feel harsh that a family member or partner is telling you something in a way that's a little too brutal for you, just let them know. They might not be aware of it. Heck, old Wilhelm here, I was not aware of a lot of that growing up. And then certain feeling types would tell me, but they would not tell me in the manner that a thinking type kind of needs to hear it. I don't know if you know, but depending on your value system and your cognitive functions, when you're told certain things, you might be told something outright, but you might not understand it at all coming from somebody else's words, because they're using words from their value system, which might be completely different from yours. So if any of that is of interest to you in a deeper analysis sort of way and how we can help society thrive and really help each other out instead of wanting to go, crazy anytime someone does something that, sets somebody off, I have a video about that goes really in depth into that and talks about ADHD and how that is impacted as well. There should be a link above for that video. I really recommend it. It's one of the most important videos I think I've made so far. And I made quite a bit, but that one's really important. It's important for us to understand each other, to appreciate each other, and to be able to talk and discuss without getting argumentative and intense and upset. We gotta be able to see our points, but we gotta be able to speak our language. That's what that video talks about. It's gonna help you and your family and friends out. I put a lot of effort into it. It's a pretty long video, so I recommend to watch it in parts, but remember what I said, with knowledge, and applied knowledge as well, we can really move mountains. You can really help out your home, your family, your friends, so they don't have to be trolling each other and setting each other off all the time. So, something to reflect upon. So for the next point over here now, we got the people of the judging function and then people of the perceiver function. So for people of the judging function, they like closure. Decisions, scheduled, organized, planned, control, no. People of the perceiver function, openness, options, spontaneous, disorganized, experience, flexible, later. TLDR, for all y'all rolling your eyes, basically type A person J, type B person P. In layman's terms, but it's more complicated than that. So it's much more deeper than that. Basically, you can refine any of those functions. So people with the J function, a lot of the time, they really like to have an organized schedule and like to have their stuff done a certain way. They don't like surprises, improvisation. I've worked with a couple of Js, or people with the J function, who don't even know what improvisation means. And I'm like, you know what, I am not surprised at all. Anyway, though, but at the same time, having ADHD, it can really impact these functions. Imagine what having a perceiver function and having inattentive ADHD can do to someone. Oh yeah, schedules, being late to stuff, forgetting to pay certain bills, calamity, disorganization, procrastination. Need I say more? And then some people with the J function might have trouble with all of those things as well. But this can create an internal anxiety mess in the mind because of always needing to be perhaps a bit more on the perfectionistic side, or growing up in a home where you were really anxious perhaps because your parents were really intense if you didn't deliver in some capacity at home or at school academically. That creates a lot of anxiousness in you, and change and modification to schedules and certain things might be really anxiety inducing. So you tie in the fact that some houses or some families, it's a mixture of all the good perceivers and Js. So meaning that different family members are going to be perceivers, different family members are going to be Js, and it might overlap. But you might drive each other insane is what I'm trying to get at, if you didn't catch my drift already. So we got to be understanding of that. Think of those two letters as the motor of the personality type. Out of the 4 letters, the perceiver or the judging function in this instance are that 4th letter. Think of it as the motor that drives the personality type. So we have what we like. Perceivers like flexibility and working on stuff if they really need to work on it. People, the J function, a lot of the time they like stuff done when it's planned. Now, these can be or are over exaggerated just to kind of make a point, because I mean, I've worked with people, the J function, who are very perceiver like. At the same time, work with perceivers who are very J like, so it overlaps. You can refine both functions. You can make them worse too. That's life. Well, we gotta try to refine them, right? So anyway, let's be considerate of each other and these different functions that we got. Now let's move on to the next point. So remember earlier when I mentioned a couple of helpful phrases that can help you out when discussing some stuff that's a little hard to discuss? Well, now is the time we're going to discuss it. Here it goes. So, very lovely post that I found online, verbal control of confrontational situations. So, it's recommended for you not to make ironclad statements. Wilhelm, what are those? Statements that are ironclad are statements that are a little bit like this. I know, always, never, won't. Especially with that sassiness and intensity, yeah, it can get pretty brutal. So it's not recommended to use those when you're talking. Do not say to your partner or family member, you always do this, you never do that, I won't do this, I know you, or etc, etc, etc. It just, oh my lord. For some reason, Luann from King of the Hill just came to mind. But anyway, moving on. So what's recommended to say? Make conditional statements. So what's recommended to say? Make conditional statements. Statements like, in my judgment, I think, in my opinion, it's my belief, the rule does not allow, by rule, according to rule. You're probably asking yourself, what rules are those? Well, those rules are perhaps the boundaries, ideally, that you would talk to your family member about. And those are boundaries that you need to discuss at some point. It's like, please don't do this to me, or say this to me. If you want to talk, please be open to talk, but not in a way where you're going to make me feel harsh or try to degrade me, but in a way where we can both be in mutual agreement not to hurt each other, but to love and understand each other and want to help each other out by learning more about one another. That's what it means by the rule for those last examples. So I hope this is of some help, and you can definitely use this, and there's plenty of other resources online that can help you, and videos on YouTube as well of how to confront a parent, a family member, a boss, fill in the blank. There's all sorts of videos out there. Give it a Google search, a DuckDuckGo search, a YouTube search. You'll find something. Plenty of helpful content out there for all y'all. Alright? And now last but certainly not least, let's talk about the boundary types. There's different boundaries after all that we can use to protect ourselves, help each other out, and help those around us out as well. Sometimes we assume that family members or friends might know these, and we assume that other people might know these, but they might not always know. And we don't have to be brutal about it too. We can be considerate when we talk, because again, if you come at it from a brutal tone, hey, guess what? The other family member or friend might have ADHD as well, and you might trigger that, and it's just going to get worse. So be considerate about how you deliver the information and how you set boundaries, because that's going to make all the difference in the end in terms of whether the person is going to want to apply it or not. So really be considerate. It's going to make all the difference. The first boundary we have on here is time boundaries. How much time you spend with someone doing something, or time boundaries at work. With ADHD, it's a lot easier said than done, but you can utilize apps on your phone, you can utilize alarms, you can utilize your notes and different reminders of all different sorts. Most smartphones have it, and most other phones have it too, so you can utilize them to help you out. It's really going to make a difference If you have something you have to do, really be considerate. I know it's really hard sometimes to separate ourselves from having fun, especially when we are out and about. But we have to be considerate about that and respect the boundary of time that we have allocated for the project, the deadline, or whatever we're working on. So, very important. Now, we also got physical boundaries. Very touchy subject, especially these days. But anyway, physical boundaries. Boundaries around physical proximity, sexuality, and how much space you share with others. So, everyone's got their personal space. That's like the bubble they got around them. Anybody gets too close, yeah, it can get a little, hey, what are you doing in my personal space? So, advocate for yourself. Remember, you don't have to be brutal. The person might not know. And for some people, their language of love is touch. So they're just kind of like that. I grew up with some friends who were like that, and a group of other friends who just refused. Especially my INTJ friends who just like, they don't like any sort of touch. And when I give them a hug, they cringe beyond all belief. And it's absolutely glorious. But anyway, I digress. So yeah, just be careful with that and be considerate to people and their physical boundaries. Okay, folks? Next boundary, we got the conversational boundaries, much of which we're talking about, of course. Topics you're open to discussing and not discussing, and when you would like to discuss it. Because at the same time, we can't just be like, hey, we don't want to discuss that, and then you never approach it. How are you going to grow? You have to allocate a time, and you have to prepare yourself, obviously, especially if it's an emotional difficulty. But you have to be able to talk about it at some point. Make it a goal for you to approach that and talk about whatever subject matter needs to be addressed. Don't just be like, I'm not discussing it, and then never bring it up. No. You're never going to grow as a person, and the problem is never going to resolve itself for the most part. So, it's important to discuss, but at the same time, it's important to set a boundary as to when you'd like to talk about it and where you do not want to talk about it. Because not every place is a place to discuss stuff like this. We got to be considerate, especially if it's a private matter or a very personal or emotional matter. We got to be considerate to all those involved. Next boundary we have is the relationship boundaries. These are boundaries mutually agreed upon with your close friends and partner. So sometimes some of us have been through quite a bit of things, and sometimes some of our partners can get a little too on the flirtatious side, perhaps, with other friends and people, and it might bother a partner, especially if they've been through a lot. So I'm going to make a whole nother video about that, about people with ADHD and those who have been cheated on and what it can do in terms of making you treat your partner perhaps a way that you're not even aware of, that you're projecting things of your past onto your current partner. And that's due to a lot of reasons, and it's very deep, and it's something I've seen quite a bit, a lot in the people I've worked with. So that's the hint as to the next video coming up. So anyway though, but relationship boundaries are truly important. The relationship should be something sacred and something you value and respect with you and your partner. It's a living, breathing thing, and if you don't respect the boundaries that the both of you agreed upon, then maybe you can refine or amend the boundaries in a way that works for the both of you. You got to understand the boundaries that you've set now that are good for where you're at now in life might need to change later on. It depends on the boundary. It depends on what you agreed upon. But there needs to be room for discussion. There needs to be room to talk and reflect upon what some of those things are. Because otherwise it can get tense, and then no one's ever going to grow, and the relationship's not going to thrive like how it could. And then the other type of boundary we have is personal boundaries. These are boundaries you have placed. These are boundaries you have placed with yourself based on awareness of your own unique needs. This is why I keep saying that knowledge is power, and applied knowledge does the ordeal. Because if you don't know yourself, if you don't know your ADHD, if you don't know what triggers you, if you don't know what sets you off, if you don't know what hurts you, if you don't know what makes you happy, if you don't know yourself, your life is going to be very difficult, because you are going to be out there going by chance when it comes to stuff. What do I mean by chance? Like, you're going to go out there and people are not going to know how to tell you certain things or how to approach you for certain things. And you might be disappointed because you might not even know yourself in that capacity to tell them to not do that, maybe. And there's might be resentment for, hey, how come the people just can't pick up on it? Because sometimes we ourselves are not even aware of this. So self-reflection is definitely necessary. I try to provide as much content as I can on here in terms of providing ADHD resources and quite a bit of videos on self-reflection. So you might want to check some of those out, because that can be pretty tough if we have only recently found out we have ADHD. Reflecting upon that can be really heavy, but at the same time is very necessary, because you learn to forgive yourself for stuff, and you learn that you can grow and you can refine yourself if you tame the ADHD by getting a treatment that works for you. Whether that's medication, whether that's supplements, whether that's exercise, or any of the many positive alternatives out there, or a combination of multiple, like me. I was able to turn my life around in my mid-20s, and that's what really inspired me to get this channel going in my profession, working with the mental health community and working with the ADHD community. So I really do believe you can change. So this point really hits close to home for me, because I really do feel that if you learn about yourself and your weaknesses and strengths and really refine yourself, you can really conquer ADHD and really become the best version of yourself. You can thrive in your life, and I truly believe that. And I'm sure your family members would too. But you gotta get to know yourself. Remember, you matter as well. And then the final boundary here, we have content boundaries. These are things you will and will not consume or will have monitored consumption on social media, TV, and etc. So it's important to reflect and know these and think about them and talk about them when you feel comfortable doing so with a family member. Believe you me, people care more than you think. It's just sometimes it's really hard to admit that, hey, we need assurance, we need love, we need A, B, and C. And it's like, because we don't want to feel that rejection of, oh, what if the person doesn't deliver? It's worth a shot. You gotta understand too that some people, it's not because they don't want to, it's just because they do not have perhaps the motivation to do so. When we have ADHD, we have issues of motivation and lack of concentration, lack of drive sometimes. And sometimes the reward system really negatively impacts us because we feel really emotionally vulnerable, especially if we haven't eaten or if we haven't slept enough. So we gotta know ourselves, we gotta know the ADHD, and then we can thrive and we can refine and we can improve not only ourselves and our life, but that of our family members and those around us who care about us. So I hope this video was of some help and perhaps a good educational experience for you. Perhaps maybe you can show it to somebody who you really think will benefit from it. That's why I make this content. So we can learn, we can refine, and we can conquer our ADHD. With that being said, this is Wilhelm, your ADHD comrade, over and